sending data down to dedicated payload ground stations. So right now, Exact Earth has a dedicated Earth station in Svalbard, Norway, way up north, which allows them to receive data from almost every orbit, because all of these satellites are in sun-synchronous orbit. That payload data then, and the spacecraft telemetry and all that kind of supporting data gets sent to the Payload Operations Center in Cambridge, and then that's where the payload planning activities take place. So the guys that are responsible for planning the observations task each of the satellites to collect data over a specific part of the globe. That, in conjunction with the Data Operations Center in Cambridge, where the data is processed and distributed to customers, and then there's that central data storage facility in Toronto that I was talking about. And that's all sort of been put together within the last, I'd say, 2 years. And it's in a limited operational capability now. Their first dedicated AIS payload, which is the hosted Indian payload, is now flying. They also are getting data from a couple of satellites that SpaceQuest US built, and there's a couple more that they're building. And then, of course, once ADS-1B and M3MSEC get launched, that just continues to add to this constellation. So they'll have even better coverage as time goes on. So that's it for my presentation. I am happy to try and answer any questions anybody might have.
So in the last diagram you've got, so
Yep.
the satellites are collecting a whole bunch of data and then you're downlinking it. How
Yep.
much processing do you actually do in satellite before you transfer it to the ground?
At this point, sort of in this first generation of satellites, there's very little onboard processing that happens. It's primarily just collection of RF signals and then piping that down to the ground, and the processing is done mainly on the ground. In future advanced versions of these AIS payloads, there will be onboard processing done, and that will help us to reduce the amount of data that actually has to be sent down to the ground.
So I'm interested in sort of the life cycle of the satellites. You mentioned before that one of them was built for 6 months and it's now still flying 3 years later.
Yeah.
So what do you expect to fail after the 6 months? Or how do you set that 6 month window of what you hope for?
Well, one of the things in this sort of microspace realm is, rather than using all purposely designed hardware for space, which is expensive and takes a long time to develop and qualify and all of that, you judiciously choose to use commercial off-the-shelf components, mostly in your electronics. So things like memory, processors, FPGAs, things like that. And those components, many of those designs have gotten so good now for use in cell phones and computers, things like that, that arguably they're almost as good as what's designed for space, purposely designed for space. But you have to be a little bit careful what you're choosing. I mean, one of the things you have to be careful about in orbit is radiation, especially if you're flying in low Earth orbit. You're flying through the lower Van Allen belts all the time. There's don't know if you guys are familiar with, there's a phenomenon called the South Atlantic anomaly, which is a part of the lower Van Allen belt that is lower in altitude than the rest of it. It's sort of, the belt isn't perfectly symmetrical, it's kind of oblong, and because the Earth isn't perfectly round, it bulges at the equator. So there's an area over the South Atlantic where radiation effects are worse for satellites in low Earth orbit. So when a satellite flies through that area, it gets hit with more radiation than the rest of the orbit. And if you look at a history of satellite failures in low Earth orbit, you'll see that a lot of them have occurred over the South Atlantic anomaly. So radiation's a big one. That's probably the main impact to using commercial electronics. If they're not shielded against radiation, their chances are they're going to see some hits. And you have to decide how you're going to tolerate that. Hopefully, they're not permanent defects that are caused by these radiation hits. In many cases, they're just bit flips that you might cause an upset. So you might see a blip in your data, or you might see a point in your memory somewhere where you get some corruption. But you may be able to tolerate that if you have memory wash routines, if you do a reset. There's ways to tolerate that, and that's what we did on NTS. So that's really the main limiter to lifetime. There's other things, secondary things like your solar cells degrade over time, your batteries degrade over time as you cycle. But yeah, radiation is probably the number one thing you need to worry about. We actually got lucky on NTS a few times. We did see some memory effects from radiation, and generally they happen over the South Atlantic anomaly. So when we do a memory read, we'll notice there's some corruption in some of the memory banks. Then that sometimes it also causes an increase in current consumption in processors, for example. And so you'll take a hit every now and then. You'll notice these things, start to worry about them a little. Like, how long is this thing gonna last? If it was originally intended to consume 100 milliwatts, and now we're seeing 200, like how long is this thing gonna last? Then a few weeks or months later, we'll get another radiation hit, and lo and behold, suddenly the current drops and the memory's clean. Kind of really strange, like we wouldn't have expected that, but we've actually been lucky. The South Atlantic anomaly has helped us a couple of times. Go figure. So yeah, we have been lucky. There's no doubting that. We've definitely been lucky, but it's a good solid design, and yeah, it's lasted a lot longer than we expected.
So how many ground stations do you have around the globe? Like you mentioned the one in Norway.
Yeah.
And do you have one in Cambridge, and then?
So we don't have one in Cambridge yet. That is one option that we're looking at, putting in a dedicated ground station at our Mission Operations Center. But it would probably only be for commissioning activities, right after launch, when you're checking out the satellite, making sure everything works. We probably wouldn't use it for downloading large volumes of mission data, payload data.
Okay.
That's what that one in Norway is intended for. And we also have cooperative agreements with a few other sites around the world. And so Exact Earth is looking at, like for example, on one of the things that as a result of the hosted Indian payload was we have access to a ground station in India to download data. So there's one there. The ADS-1B spacecraft that Surrey's building for us, initially they will be operating it. So we'll have access to their ground station. And they can collect mostly telemetry, not a lot of payload data. But yeah, so we don't have, or Exact Earth I should say, doesn't have a lot of dedicated ground stations, but they have these agreements where you can basically rent time, essentially, on dishes that other people own, because in most cases they're not fully utilized all the time.
Mm-hmm.
They need them for specific passes for specific satellites when they fly over, but then there's a lot of idle time in there. So they will basically rent time to other people who have other missions that don't conflict with theirs.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how we build up extra capacity.
So you mentioned the radiation and commercial